Coming up on Arirang News, Japan starts enforcing its new restrictions on exports to South Korea amid criticism from around the world. Japan denies that it's an embargo, but Korean tech firms are facing a potentially serious shortage of key supplies. Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi says Japan's new measures are a clear act of retaliation against South Korea for issues related to the two countries' history. And he warns that the measures will hurt not only South Korea, but Japan as well. And President Moon Jae-in meets with one of Japan's top business leaders, who's of Korean descent. Other presidential aides, meanwhile, consulting with Korea's biggest tech firms on a response. It's 4:00 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for joining us on our afternoon newscast. I'm Devin Whiting. It's been only 3 days since that third North Korea-U.S. summit, but Pyongyang is condemning Washington for being, quote, hell-bent on sanctions. North Korea is angry that the U.S. sent letters to the UN Security Council calling on member states to ramp up pressure on the North. Oh Jung-hee has more.
In response to U.S. efforts to turn the screw on North Korea at the UN, the North says the U.S. is becoming more aggressive in its hostility toward the regime. Last month, the U.S. and 23 other countries sent a letter to the UN Security Council's North Korea Sanctions Committee calling for urgent actions to deal with the North importing far more refined petroleum than the annual cap of 500,000 barrels. The U.S. wanted the committee to demand an immediate halt in petroleum deliveries to the North, but China and Russia blocked the move. According to North Korea's UN mission, the U.S., France, Germany, and Britain sent a letter to all UN member states. The letter urged them to repatriate North Korean workers abroad to ramp up sanctions pressure. The North noted how the letter was sent on June 29th, the exact day when President Trump proposed to North Korea's Kim Jong-un that they meet for a handshake at the inter-Korean border. Pyongyang's UN mission issued a press statement. It said even though the U.S. says it wants dialogue, these actions really show Washington is becoming more and more, quote, hell-bent on hostile acts against North Korea. It added the North is not desperate to have sanctions lifted. The North also called on UN member states to be wary of Washington's, quote, deliberate attempts to undermine peace on the Korean peninsula. On June 30th, Trump met with Kim Jong-un at the inter-Korean truce village of Panmunjom and announced afterwards that the two agreed to start working-level talks this month on denuclearization. Trump added that sanctions will remain, but it looks forward to lifting them when the North makes progress. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
South Korea's main opposition Liberty Korea Party has slammed the Moon Jae-in administration, accusing it of causing concern and fear. In a policy speech on Thursday, floor leader Na Kyung-won said the government is losing ground, both economically and diplomatically. The government, she said, is only interested in digging up dirt on previous conservative administrations. But instead, it needs to start listening to the opposition to solve problems, including Japan's latest trade measures against South Korea. As for the recent DMZ meeting between the leaders of the two Koreas and the U.S., she said North Korea still hasn't given up its nuclear weapons, so nothing has changed. But she called for the administration to actively try and set up regular reunions for separated families and to enable them to write to each other. Na also apologized to the people for the long standstill at the National Assembly, vowing to make up for it by carrying out reforms in the political and judiciary sectors in a way that is fair. President Moon has made some changes to his staff for public communications. The Blue House spokesperson announced Thursday that the new secretary to the president for public relations planning will be Jung Gu-chul. Jung is currently the standing auditor of the Korea Federation of Small and Medium Enterprises, but he served as the presidential secretary for the domestic press under former President Roh Moo-hyun. He replaces Yoo Min-young. The president's secretary for digital communication, Jung Hae-sung, will be replaced by Kang Jung-soo. Kang is the CEO of Mediati, a company that mentors local media startups, and he's also a professor of business administration at Yonsei University. Some of the UK's most prominent politicians have expressed support for the demonstrators in Hong Kong who broke into and vandalized offices of the Hong Kong government in protest against a now scrapped proposal to extradite Hong Kong people to mainland China. These public statements by Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt and now by Boris Johnson have sparked a growing row between Beijing and the UK. Hong Yu reports.
Boris Johnson, the former London mayor and frontrunner in the Tory leadership contest, and therefore favored to become the next UK Prime Minister, said he supported the Hong Kong protesters. In an interview with Reuters on Wednesday, he said he understands why they're skeptical about the controversial extradition bill that the protesters are fighting to completely scrap.
So yes, I do support them, and I will happily speak up for them and back them every inch of the way. And I was stressed to our friends in Beijing that the one country, two systems approach has worked, is working, and should not be cast aside.
Amid the escalating spat over Hong Kong, which Britain handed over to China in 1997, Beijing has told the UK to keep its hands off the territory. On Wednesday, China's foreign ministry said it had lodged a diplomatic complaint with London, denouncing Hunt as shameless for his warning of consequences if Beijing breached the Sino-British declaration. The growing war of words follows a weeks-long protest over the controversial extradition bill, marking the 22nd anniversary of Hong Kong's handover from Britain to China. Protesters stormed Hong Kong's Legislative Council building on Monday, vandalizing walls and hanging the old British colonial flag before they were dispersed by riot police. Hong Kong police announced on Wednesday that they have arrested 12 people involved in the incident for offenses such as the possession of offensive weapons and unlawful assembly. Hong Yu, Arirang News.
In the coming days, Iran says it will start enriching uranium at a higher level than it's permitted to under the 2015 nuclear deal. Iran had already said this week that its stockpiles now exceed the limit the deal prescribes. Lee Seung-jae reports.
Tehran is raising the stakes again in its confrontation with the West. Just 2 days after Iran announced that it had surpassed previously set limits on its stockpile of low-enriched uranium, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani said Wednesday that his country will increase its uranium enrichment levels after this weekend.
From July 7th, we will take the next step. If you wish to express regret, then please do it now, or if you wish to issue a communique, then please issue one now. From July 7th, our level of uranium enrichment will no longer remain at 3.67% level. We will put this commitment to one side.
Under the Obama-era nuclear deal, Iran had agreed to slash its stockpile by 90% and cap its uranium enrichment at 3.67%. However, after Sunday, that limit will be breached. However, Iranian officials insist they have not broken the agreement, stressing it was European nations like Germany, Britain, and France that failed to uphold their commitments. But Rouhani claimed everything can be reversed, but only if the other parties make good on the promises they've made.
All the steps that we're taking can be reserved in the space of 1 hour to the previous terms. Why are you so worried? We have told you that if you carry out your part of the deal, then we will return to the first point.
Meanwhile, in response to Rouhani's announcement, Trump took to Twitter on Wednesday to denounce Iran's actions, warning them to be careful with the threats. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
This weekend, if you're in Seoul, it'll be a chance to enjoy a sport that's not often seen in Korea. It's the Seoul Sevens International Rugby Festival, to be held on Saturday and Sunday at Mokdong Stadium. Organized by the Seoul Rugby Union, there will be around 240 participants from 6 different countries. The top teams in each division will win prize money of around $8,500 US. Even better, entry for spectators is free regardless of age. Besides the rugby, there will be other entertainment, including cheerleading shows and tag rugby for kids. From today, Japan is enforcing new restrictions on the export of high-tech materials to South Korea used in semiconductors. It's a decision seen as retaliation for Korea's efforts to resolve historical issues between the two countries. Japan, though, says it's not an embargo and should not be linked to those questions of history. Kim Yo-sun has the latest.
Japan's export restrictions on semiconductor and display materials to South Korea begin Thursday amid the continued diplomatic row over Tokyo's use of Koreans for forced labor during World War II. Tokyo's trade ministry abruptly announced this week that exports to Seoul of high-tech materials used in semiconductor and smartphone production will have to be approved on a contract-by-contract basis. It added South Korea will be removed from its list of countries such as the U.S. and European nations that have minimum restrictions on trade. Speaking at a political debate in Tokyo on Wednesday, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe stressed the move is not an embargo.
If another country doesn't keep their promise, you can't have preferential treatment like before. And some media don't report this properly. But it's not an embargo. It just means you can't have preferential treatment as you have so far.
He added the restrictions should not be linked to historical issues between the two countries, insisting the move does not violate WTO rules. Fielding a question on Japan's new restrictions, Seoul's Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa said Wednesday that her ministry has used various diplomatic channels to demand Tokyo scrap the ban. Calling it an unreasonable retaliatory measure, Kang said it will hurt bilateral economic ties and global trade, vowing to work with other countries who could also be affected. South Korea's stance is drawing support from places you might not expect. Japan's Asahi Shimbun published an editorial on Wednesday urging Tokyo to withdraw such measures that go against the principle of free trade. It also noted how such a move is in stark contrast with the declaration Japan made as the host of last week's G20 summit in Osaka, during which it stressed trade shall be free, fair, and non-discriminatory. The Tokyo Shimbun also criticized the Japanese government for its not-so-wise decision to escalate tensions through trade restrictions. Other media outlets in China, the UK, and the US also pointed out that such a move will only harm Japan, with the Wall Street Journal condemning Tokyo for taking a page from President Trump's playbook. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
South Korea's finance minister Hong Nam-gi, meanwhile, has criticized Japan's new trade restrictions, also calling them a clear act of economic retaliation. In an interview Thursday with CBS Radio, Hong said the government will take countermeasures if Japan does not back down. The restrictions, he said, will not only hurt the Korean economy, but also Japan's. As for filing a complaint at the World Trade Organization, Hong said the government will decide when to file a complaint after an internal review, but noted that it takes a long time for such complaints to yield a result. The Blue House has confirmed that the presidential office and the government are contacting major South Korean companies to try and respond effectively to those measures. The Deputy Chief of National Security, Kim Hyun-jong, met yesterday with the leaders of Samsung Electronics, including Vice Chairman Kim Gi-nam. The Deputy National Security Chief served previously as Chief Negotiator on Trade, so he's actively engaged in the consultations due to the issue's direct link to national interests. The Presidential Chief of Staff for Policy, Kim Sang-jo, also met with the Samsung Vice Chairman earlier this week. He's expected to meet with other groups as well, including LG Electronics and SK Hynix. President Moon Jae-in is meeting this afternoon at the Blue House with one of Japan's top billionaire businessmen, the CEO of the conglomerate SoftBank. That's Song Jung-ui, who's of Korean descent and is also known as Masayoshi Son. It's expected that President Moon will be asking for his thoughts on innovative growth and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, fields in which Son has vast experience. Ties, of course, are tense right now between South Korea and Japan because of Japan's new trade restrictions. Today's meeting, the Blue House says, was requested by Son. It's time now for a closer look at what's happening in the markets today. And for that, I'm joined on the line now by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Kiwoom Securities. Mr. Yu, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
So the rally on Wall Street continued into Wednesday, yet more record highs with the S&P closing in on 3,000. U.S. markets, of course, will be closed on the 4th of July, but how are the markets looking today globally and in Korea?
Yes. As you said, most of the markets are rising quite rapidly due to the increased liquidity in the system. Most of the people are expecting that the interest rate will be lowered in the future. The International Monetary Policy, IMF, Managing Director, Christine Lagarde, has been nominated as the next president of the ECB. And most of the people are thinking that she will be much more dovish and continue to provide low interest rate environment for Europe. Also, the President Donald Trump said that on Tuesday, that he is going to nominate Judy Shelton and Christopher Waller for the Fed governor appointees. Clearly, these two people are much more pro lower interest rate environment, and clearly the central bank, the Fed, might be coming out with a much easier monetary policy going forward. Clearly, these are making movement in terms of the interest rate. We have seen 10 years government bond rate of U.S. falling to below 2% level, and continuation of the additional liquidity into the system is making liquidity rally for the market. And they're expecting that on the July of 31st, there will be lower interest rate we applied by Fed that might trigger the summer rally. Clearly, most of the markets have shown quite strong movement, including the Nikkei and Europe. But as for the Shanghai, the Chinese market, have shown some corrections today, which has fallen by about 0.7%, and Shenzhen also down 0.5%. Main reason for that is because China have said that they might not apply lower interest rate environment for the time being. They think that they have continuation of other measures to boost the economies, and that can support the current system without lower interest rate environment. Obviously, no additional liquidity means that lower market, and that's been what's happening to the Chinese market. As for Kospi, also been quite weak, but today has shown some recovery, and Kospi is up about 0.6%. The Kosdaq is down 0.26%.
Well, now today's big story is Japan's measures coming into effect restricting the sale of key semiconductor materials to Korea. The Korean government's now planning to invest billions of dollars so that Korea can make these materials domestically and won't find itself in this position again. What's the latest on the Japan situation?
Yes, I think that what Japanese government have said is probably wrongdoing in a part regards to WTO. The Korean government have begun to work on the legal reviews of the WTO lawsuit after the Japanese government decided to restrict the export of semiconductor-related materials to Korea. According to the Korean trade officials, what he said is that Japan's measures are considered to be violating the Article 11 of the General Agreement of Tariff and Trade, GATT 1994. Government have also decided that they will invest quite heavily in terms of developing the parts and equipment related to semiconductor businesses, a total amount to be about 6 trillion won. Already they have passed the law saying that they will invest 1 trillion won for the equipment and the preliminary feasibility studies, and they will be planning to add additional 5 trillion won over the next 6 years to continue to increase the production capacities related to the semiconductor business. Since 1980s, the much stronger yen environment, Korean IT sector have been moving away from Japan dependencies, and this kind of the measure by the Japanese government will accelerate the process. The Korea's current dependency regards to the components related to the IT sector has been reduced down to less than 10%. We think that that dependency is going to go down even lower in the future.
That's a really interesting point there. Meanwhile, the Bank of Korea, speaking of trade, has released its data on the current account balance. Looks like Korea is back with a surplus of almost $5 billion, certainly an improvement from the deficit posted the month before. What do you see in these numbers?
Yes. As you said, in May, Korea's current account balance turned to surplus after a negative territory the previous month. The commodity surplus, however, was the lowest in the 5 years. Clearly, the environment for the export is not doing well. With the global economic slowdown, that's what we're seeing due to the U.S.-China trade negotiations being quite timid. And obviously, that is resulting into much lesser trade amongst the countries within a global arena. So that's affecting clearly the Korean economic conditions since that the Korea's dependency on export is very high. However, though, with some possibility that the U.S. and China will be coming to some kind of agreement over the next 6 months or so, that should result into probably bottoming out of the economic growth rates for Korean economy as well as the export numbers. So yes, right now it has turned around, and still in terms of the commodity surplus is the lowest in the 5 years. But in the future, it might be improving gradually due to the better economic conditions globally.
Hopefully so. Got it, Mr. Yu. All right, we'll have to leave it there today, though. Thanks for your insights, as always.
Thank you very much.
Now, as we were just discussing, South Korea's current account was back in the black in May. This month, the month before, saw the country's first deficit in 7 years. Our Kim Da-mi has the details.
South Korea's current account surplus amounted to $4.95 billion in May. That's a turnaround from the $660 million deficit posted the month before amid sluggish exports. The BOK attributed the turnaround to a smaller services account deficit and the absence of the seasonal surge in dividend payouts that affected April's figures. It's not all good news, though, as the surplus for May is just 41% of what it had been 12 months earlier. In addition, despite the turnaround from April, the goods account surplus in May hit its lowest in 5 years at $5.4 billion. The country's bread and butter semiconductor exports dropped 30% on-year in May. That's the biggest drop since March 2009, 10 years ago. Imports decreased slightly by 1% during the same period due to weak energy prices as well as less machinery imports. The services account deficit narrowed the most since 2017 thanks to more Chinese visitors to the country and fewer Koreans traveling overseas. The current account surplus from January to May this year totaled $15.5 billion, far below the central bank's goal of $25 billion. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
After last weekend's meeting of U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping, it seemed the Chinese tech giant Huawei might have some more room to breathe. That was based on comments from Trump. But according to the U.S. government, the policy essentially blacklisting Huawei is still in place. Won Jung-hwan has the latest.
A senior Trump administration official emailed the U.S. Commerce Department's enforcement staff this week, stating that Huawei remains on its entity list and a presumption of denial licensing policy is still in place. The mail came 2 days after President Trump agreed at the G20 summit in Osaka to lift some restrictions he put in place with a May executive order in an effort to kickstart trade talks with China. But in the first and the only direction the department has given since Trump's comments, it seems the U.S. government has yet to remove Huawei from the blacklist. The email goes on to direct staff to evaluate the associated license review policy under Part 744. That includes the presumption of denial policy applied to companies that have been blacklisted. This means U.S. commerce agents are unlikely to grant American companies approval to sell to Huawei. This is a blow to Huawei as it's hoping to work with Google so it can use its Android operating system in its future mobile devices. Huawei has been the subject of long-running U.S. national security concerns due to its suspected links with the Chinese government and the belief its equipment could be used for spying, suspicions the company denies. With the news, it's unclear if the Commerce Department will adjust to match President Trump's comments, although an internal memo suggests that even White House advisors were caught off guard by Trump's comments in Osaka. However, despite the confusion over Huawei's status, trade talks between the U.S. and China could restart sooner than expected. White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow said Wednesday that top representatives from the two sides will meet in the coming week to continue their negotiations. Watchers expect the talks to bring some clarity to the situation surrounding Huawei. Won Jung-hwan, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.